We are here. All of the spoilers have come out, and we are going to delve in. It is incredible. The set is just, I think, exceeding all expectations, and starting out here with some beautiful art by Richard Kane Ferguson with Toxic Deluge, one of my favorite Magic artists. His body of work really hit me with Alliances and Pillage, which was just a perfectly executed Magic card, right down to the flavor text. That's a piece that I think ended up in England. I almost bought that art when it was available many years ago on eBay. It only sold for like $1,000 or $2,000, which at the time I thought was really undervalued. It was very new to the Magic art market at the time, and I may want to end up with that piece at some point. It really is gorgeous, and this one is as well. I mean, I love to see an artist's style evolve through the years, and so many of these artists really have continued to level up and just improve on their craft while also having a style that is, their own unique voice in the work. Toxic Deluge, also a great Magic card, sees a ton of play, legacy playable, and I'll never forget watching a game of Elves where the opponent really went into the tank on their natural order, thought about it, and then decided to grab a Progenitus instead of the Craterhoof, as Craterhoof would have put their opponent down to just 5 life, and instead they ended up grabbing the Progenitus, and on the next turn, Toxic Deluge was drawn, the entire board was wiped out, and that was it. If he had grabbed the Craterhoof, then Toxic Deluge would have been uncastable, and that would have been a victory in the other direction. But a great Magic card that puts people to the test and is a great inclusion in this set, as it's worth quite a lot. And I think this box topper will be hugely popular for Commander and Legacy players alike. Deep Glow Skate. This is a Commander card. When it enters the battlefield, double the number of double the number of each kind of counter on any number of target permanents. So you basically just double all of the counters on all the stuff you want to, and there's no surprise why Commander players absolutely love this card. A staple in Super Friends decks, as it can push your Planeswalkers to their ultimate abilities right out of the gate. And this one is reprinted it rare, so it will likely take a much bigger hit than the mythics of this set. Speaking of high value mythics, Imperial Recruiter, just incredible. This card, it is really, really good. So we weren't sure when this card was only in P3K kind of where the price should be, just because of how it was a playable card. It was only available in P3K, super limited print run. Then it got a Judge reprint, and then eventually the Masters 25 reprint, and now we're seeing it again in Double Masters. And I don't think there'll be any doubt that people will be able to get this card if they need it at this point. Once the Masters reprint happened, it really was not a particularly difficult card to acquire. I understand some stores would have a tough time getting P3K stuff, as it was a super short print run, but this is going to put a ton of these out in the wild, and Alurin players will certainly have a consideration as to what they want to be running. Are you running Imperial Recruiter? Are you running Recruiter of the Guard? And at this stage, I think this card is it's going to be out there. I'm very interested to see what happens to the price. It had really kind of stabilized at a really solid number. This could... it's not clear how much demand there is for this card, as the decks it's played in are kind of fringe. A Braid. Now, this is actually a super exciting printing, because if you notice, this is now a common, which brings it into Pauper, and that is a whole new ball game. Now, this will unfortunately wipe out a little bit of money for kind of new players who had gotten a set of Abrades for Modern or whatever, and they had to pay a few bucks each. This card's going to tank hard being at common. We'll see if it ever rebounds. A lot of the time, if it's printed at common, it's a lot to ask for a card to actually recoup from that. Cast down, another downshifted card, and that clause probably could not matter less in Pauper. Legendary creatures are not exactly common fare, and this is going to be a very powerful effect at 2 mana. Notice it's only 1 black as well, so blue-based control decks can take advantage of this card, and this is very solid removal for Pauper. 1 mana obviously is preferable for your removal, but You also needed to actually remove the things that you're up against, and this removes just about everything that could be in your way. Esperzoa. I actually like this card for beginner players. So I got to play some Magic with my nephews this summer. This card threw them for a loop. We did a Modern Masters cube, like a sealed deck, recreated packs, and this card absolutely, like, they had to grapple with how the heck this card could be used. The stats are amazing, but they didn't really understand that it's an artifact because it's blue. So they're just like, oh, it's a blue artifact. So then they had to keep returning it, and eventually at some point, actually, I think it was just terrible for them. They didn't end up drawing another artifact, but great for abusing enter the battlefield triggers if you have them. And of course, if you're just putting it out there as a 4/3 blocker every turn, you're not going to be very excited. So you gotta build your deck with a little bit of skill to make that card useful. But in the right artifact deck, it can absolutely be a powerhouse, a 4/3 that's constantly resetting some type of enter the battlefield ability. Glass Dusk Hulk, a 3/4 for 5. And also gets bigger when you play when artifacts enter the battlefield under your control. Definitely a possibility for the artifact-based strategies, which look like they'll be really strong in the limited formats here. This got a lot of support for artifact decks. Hinder. This card used to be amazing, and then Commander players decided that they like fun more than anything, and literally changed the rules of Commander to make this card just no big deal. Now, when a commander would go from the stack to anywhere, well, I don't even know how they phrased it. Basically, if your commander is going to go on the bottom of your deck, you get to put it in the command zone now. The Tuck rule, as it's called, was made to prevent cards from Hinder from being too devastating, and that was a decision from the community. I mean, I don't know. If you're entirely based on your commander being the reason your deck works, maybe if it gets tucked, you deserve it. I don't know. It is what it is. I mean, you play by the rules, and if you don't like them, you change the rules, and that's where we're at with Hinder. Is it Charm? 2 mana, all-around solid card, bunch of modes, and this one, I think it crept up to like $1, something like that. So reprinted it uncommon. I mean, it'll take a hit, but it's at least some potential value in the packs. Invigorate. Infect All-Star. I think this was actually banned in Pauper. Anyways, the common, it was printed at common, but I think it's actually banned in Pauper. I feel like Infect would be way too good if it wasn't. And yeah, this card just does a great job at what it does, which is make a creature bigger, winning a combat situation. Yeah, they gain some life, so you're generally not going to be using it to pump your creature to push through damage, but if you're pushing through poison counters through Infect, or if you're just trying to win a combat situation, this card is very, very powerful. Ravenous Intruder. It's a gremlin instead of an ATOG, and that's really all you can say here. That's it. I mean, I don't know why it's not ATOG. I like ATOG. I guess it's fine to have more ATOGs, even though this one's a gremlin. It's the same type of effect, so I guess if you need 8 or more ATOGs in your deck, you've got this type of option now. Pongify. This is a card that was probably, $5-6? And again, we've got this coming in. Good in limited and constructed. This reprint will add a little bit of value at the uncommon slot to the packs. Welding Jar. Now, this is a card that I've got some history with. Most of you won't know this, but in the early days of Vintage in New England, when the scene really started taking off, in the late 90s, early 2000s era, I actually made a bunch of proxies for power. I took welding jars erased with acetone and then used a typewriter to type in text and then hand drew on every single piece a proxy. And it was made to be an homage to the original. New frame, so obviously you couldn't confuse it. And I was drawing on them with markers. I mean, this was not in any way possible to confuse with the real thing. And at all of my tournaments, I would give them away with the entry fee. They became so popular, they ended up with a secondary market value of about $15, even though I gave them away for free. And I made one copy of each foil card as well, which ended up having an incredibly high value. I saw one of those actually get traded for a foil merchant scroll. So anyways, I've probably murdered, what would that be, the 5 Moxen plus the Black Lotus. So at least that would be 300 welding jars. So it was a card that I didn't think was going to be worth anything ever. I had the choice in between that and several other cards. I'm glad I didn't do Mishra's Bauble, because that was also a consideration. But Welding Jar at common was something that I was able to make a ton of. Eventually got a cease and desist from Wizards of the Coast on that one. They contended that that was making counterfeit cards, which I was actually okay with stopping because it was such a tremendous amount of work, and I had already done the full Power 9. But yeah, that was an amusing thing. I actually saved that email in my inbox. I look it up every once in a while just to get a chuckle, as Wizards was actually pretty miffed about me drawing on Magic cards and giving them away. Springleaf Drum, 1 mana. This card sees a ton of play in affinity strategies, which we're seeing a lot of support for, including Welding Jar. I mean, that's support for affinity as well. Interesting, I don't think there's any affinity cards like Mirror Enforcer or Frogmite in this set. We'll see as we go through it. We are going to cover all of the remaining cards, but this very good with kind of spamming the board, giving your creatures that you've played for the turn the ability to tap for mana, as it does not require haste here. You just tap this and an untapped creature, so you can tap a summoning sick creature to give you that extra boost. Essentially, when the deck is running smoothly, that means that you're getting a 1 casting cost card that taps for 1 mana in most situations. Yavimaya Embrace. It's a bomb. I mean, stealing their creature and giving it +2/+2 and trample is incredibly potent on even a 2/2 is a big swing. This used to be a rare. The mana cost is really the main issue. 8 is an awful lot to ask, but if you're already in blue and green, this is not going to be embarrassing to sleeve up in your limited format. Probably better in sealed deck than it is in draft, as sealed tends to be slower. Angel of the Dawn, again, just a limited card here. At common, when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1 in vigilance until end of turn is a game-winning effect, and any white deck in limited going to be happy to play that. Ancestral Blade. Haven't actually sleeved this one up. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and you get a 1/1 soldier to slap this on when it comes down. Essentially a 2/2 for 2. That when it dies, you can use this later on, or just hand this off if need be. It's not really unreasonably costed at all. Seems totally fine. And there's a lot of good equipment in this deck, and some good equipment synergy as well. Fortify. Creatures you control get +2/+0 or +0/+2 until end of turn. A powerful overrun effect. A lot of the time when I'm playing an aggressive red-white strategy, I'll play 1 to 2 copies of a card like this just to have that final push through for damage. You really don't want to load up a deck with these type of effects, as you need creatures and removal otherwise. But again, really just for limited here. Crusader of Odric. I think this was an uncommon, if I recall correctly. Don't know that it's going to matter too much. Maybe there's going to be a token deck in Pauper that'll be happy to run it. Power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control. Keldon Warlord from way back in the day. And now it's at least a 1/1 for 3. Most likely you're going to have a few other creatures, making this probably a good value in the right deck. Crib Swap. Now this one, I'm almost positive was an uncommon. I will do another video covering all of the uncommons, or all of the newly available cards for Pauper, let's say. So things that are being printed at common for the first time. But I'm pretty darn sure Crib Swap was an uncommon. An absolute powerhouse in Lorwyn Block Limited. And I think it'll probably be really good here too. I mean, giving them a 1/1, really not that big a deal. And the fact that it's a shapeshifter in this format, I mean, I don't even think that's going to be that big a deal compared to Lorwyn, which had so much tribal synergy. Believe it or not, that 1/1 was sometimes an issue in tribal decks where they had reasons to want goblins or Kithkin or anything like that. That shapeshifter could bite you more than you'd expect from face value, but in this set, it doesn't really feel like there's too much that cares about creature types. As I say that, we've got Master Splicer. He gives golems +1/+1. So, I mean, there's an example. Maybe there'll be more. When this enters the battlefield, you get that 3/3 colorless golem, and there's a bunch of different splicers that do that. And this one is fine. I mean, 4 mana for a 1/1 plus a 4/4 is totally fine. The fact that you can flicker this guy is very dangerous. If you have any type of flicker effects or any type of bounce replay, anything along those lines. Glint Sleeve Artisan, a 2/2 for 3 with Fabricate 1. So you're either going to get a 3/3 or a 2/2 and a 1/1. Either way, whatever works best for your strategy, which seems totally fine. Sanctum Spirit. I didn't play this block that much. I think that was an uncommon too. This 3/3 with lifelink, and you can discard a historic card to gain indestructible. If that's the case, I mean, this could be an interesting card for some control decks. It's very, very difficult to handle, and the lifelink is potentially welcome as well. Sanctum Gargoyle was tremendous in Shards of Alara Limited. The 4-mana 2/3 flyer, but also get something back from your graveyard, was very, very strong. And like I said, this seems like there's a really powerful artifact archetype available here, perhaps multiple variants on that theme. Revoke Existence, exile an artifact or enchantment. We'll see if that's main deckable in your limited deck. Historically, those haven't been, but sets like Mirrored and Shatter was actually an incredibly good Magic card. Remember the Fallen. You can return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, or an artifact, or both. And I mean, it might be okay. I err on the side of a card like Sanctum Gargoyle, where even if nothing's in your graveyard, you can still play it just to keep the pressure. If they've got a 2/2 flyer beating you down, you're very happy to cast this and kind of create a standstill. Whereas a card like Remember the Fallen is only good in the mid to late game. Early game, it does absolutely nothing. And, it's not an embarrassing card to sleeve up, but I think that type of distinction is pretty significant. I'd much rather have a Gravedigger, which can do this, rather than just a card that gets 1 or 2 cards back from the graveyard. There are times where you can have a deck that's got such a powerful bomb that you're just going to be happy to bring it back, but I mean, that's not typically how I build my limited decks, as I'd rather win even if I don't draw my best cards. Topple the Statue, tap target permanent. If it's an artifact, destroy it. This was a War of the Spark card that is getting a reprint. I think it was a common back then, moving up to uncommon, which might be better for limited balance. But, anything that draws a card and has some type of decent effect is a consideration in limited. It's definitely better to play a few cards like this than branching into a third color in most cases, if you're trying to stick with 2 colors, even if you have some cards like this that you're not super excited about. But I do think with the amount of artifacts that we're seeing, that this could be a very strong card. I mean, if you're actually going to be killing your opponent's creature and drawing a card for 3 mana at instant speed, that is actually incredibly strong. Strength of Arms, 1 mana, target creature getting +2/+2 is a solid combat trick right up front, but also you get a 1/1 soldier if you have an equipment. So this is a just quality combat trick. In limited, you don't want to play too many of these, but it's nice if you have an aggressive strategy to be playing a small amount, 2, 3, maybe 4 different pump effects, something that you can have. But most important thing, I think, in limited with this type of strategy is having the stones to turn things sideways even when you don't have the pump spell. You put them to the test. When they look at that combat situation and read the board and say, wow, if he has Strength of Arms here and I block, I just lose on the spot, they'll let him by. And then later on, they'll end up blocking once you've drawn it. I mean, that's the best for playing limited. When you put your opponent in a situation where they don't block when it was correct for them to, and then they later on block when it's a disaster, I mean, that's where you want to be. Valor in Akros. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, your creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. I mean, that's an overrun with extra steps. This is potentially fine. I mean, not the most exciting card to me, having not sleeved it up, but I could definitely see how I would be forced to sleeve this up in certain strategies. It is a breakthrough card. Usually, if you could have a +2/+0 for 3 mana at instant speed, that'll probably just win the game on the spot. This is more kind of taking off turn 4 and then, potentially being in good shape for the rest of the game if you can keep up. But, I mean, when you take turn 4 off, sometimes that's hard. Alabaster Mage, a 2 mana, 2 power creature. Those are often the bread and butter of limited decks, and giving a creature you control lifelink until end of turn can make a big difference, either on creatures with evasion, kind of getting through every turn and gaining life, making the race very difficult to win, or just making those trades a little bit more favorable as they result in some life gain. This card's totally fine for limited. Bone Picker Downshift. This costs 3 less if a creature died this turn, has flying and death touch. Expect this to actually see some play in Pauper. I'm very excited to see how this card figures in to some of the strategies out there. I'm looking at Aristocrats builds, possibly control decks, and I mean, flying and death touch is very strong. Vampire Nighthawk is a 2/3 with flying, lifelink and death touch, and that thing is just constructed gold. So this is not quite that. The lifelink is obviously a very big deal when you're trying to stabilize, but this is a good aggressive card that can also trade with anything in whatever format you're playing for the most part. Apprentice Wizard. I think this is new art. I don't recognize it. Richard Kane Ferguson again with his unique style. Apprentice Wizard, some blue acceleration, which is pretty rare. And I've played, I think the originals from the Dark has kind of a goofy looking wizard on it, and I've sleeved that up in a zombie in the past, and now you've got some options about what you want to be using. Has the new colorless mana symbols on there as well, and as is a common, and mana acceleration not the most easy to come by in Pauper for a deck like this. I mean, it does have some quality acceleration for sure. You got Dark Ritual and Lotus Petal, Cabal Ritual. There are a bunch, but as far as like recurring permanent, it's not exactly like Commander where you're just expecting to have tons and tons of ramp outside of something like, say, Urzatron. You know, most of the decks aren't playing a ton of, signets and that type of stuff as they're not available. Divest. I mean, Duress is already legal in Pauper. This is creature or artifact, so perhaps a sideboard card in Pauper. I'm not sure if this is downshifted or not. Dire Fleet Hoarder. When it dies, create a treasure token, a 2-power creature for 2 with a little bit of an upside. Kind of take whatever upside you can get there. Sacrifice an artifact or creature to get a +1/+1 counter on this. Deviant Salvager does make great use of those treasure tokens if you don't need the mana acceleration, instead just consolidating a solid board presence with this guy that can, you get to 4/4, you're starting to really dominate the board. You get bigger than that, you may be pushing your opponent into chump block every turn territory. This guy's going to be totally playable. A Costly Plunderer. Oh, that guy's actually common too. I'm not sure if he was common before. I'm going to do a whole video explaining the new Pauper cards. Costly Plunder. This one doesn't really do anything for me. It's kind of a weird decision. They just printed a card for 1 black that does this, and now we've got this 2-mana version. So I don't know. Not super exciting. It's a nice response to removal in limited, but the new, what is it, Village Rites or something, is a recent printing, which only costs 1 mana. Argivian Restoration, another downshifted card. Return an artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. Very fun with incredibly powerful effects. There's not a ton of those in Pauper that you're going to be super psyched to return. But in limited here, we may have some ability to return some big artifact creatures. Corridor Monitor. A 2-mana 1/4. When it enters the battlefield, untap target artifact or creature you control. I mean, it definitely wreaks havoc with trying to figure out the combat steps. It's a lot of stats. I mean, it's a huge butt for 2 mana. This is definitely something throwing a piece of equipment on could be very helpful for. Generally, when you're equipping stuff, it's either going to be something small that's going to trade up very nicely, or it's going to be something that can survive and just really dominate the board, and this with some equipment on it could be quite a problem. Cloud Reader Sphinx. When it enters the battlefield, scry 2, 5 mana, 3 power in the air, totally playable card for limited. Frogify, another downshift. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog with base power and toughness 1/1. So Pongify gets rid of it, makes it a 3/3 Frogify for 1 more mana. You get a 1/1. Either way, playable removal. Fairy Mechanist. This card is very good in artifact decks, especially back in Shard's block. This was a real powerhouse you were totally fine paying that extra mana as long as you were consistently hitting. That was a big thing. I'm not actually sure how many artifacts you're going to want in your deck to make sure that you always hit, but it is important that you're hitting. Otherwise, 4 mana for a 2/2 is not super exciting. Executioner's Capsule, solid removal, and with any type of recursion, this card can be just downright oppressive. There's a Glissa commander deck that I have on the shelf, which occasionally this will come together in it, and it feels bad for people. Drown in Sorrows, devastating board wipe for a lot of limited situations, was great and constructed back in the Theros Born of the Gods standard. I've got a story about a Black Lotus that I ended up getting from a tournament that I attended with that. There was a couple of ridiculous interactions at that tournament, but Drown in Sorrow was one of the cards I needed for that deck. I actually had to pick up on the day, scrambling around trying to find that new printing, as it was really some good. Driver of the Dead, when it dies, return a creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. Probably fine and limited. Parasitic Strix, you wouldn't guess by looking at this that it would have been a literal eternal playable card. This saw a lot of play in Alurin up until recently, where now this has been replaced by Cauldron Familiar. This was the way that Alurin would actually win the game. Just use Parasitic Strix with a Cavern Harpy to just play over and over and over again and just win the game. Morkrut Banshee. This card is very powerful and limited. If a creature has died, -4/-4, so you're killing a creature and getting a 4/4 for 5 mana, an incredible bargain. Metallic Rebuke, counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, and you can improvise tapping some of your artifacts. I think this might actually see some play in some formats. I'm not sure. I've definitely sold it for Commander players in recent months. Heartless Pillage. Target opponent discards 2 cards with Raid, must be from Ixalan block. Originally, you get a treasure token if you've attacked. And, I mean, these effects are actually a little bit polarizing with people's opinions. I think it does vary depending on how strong your opponents are. If people know this is in the format and know that it's possible your deck has it, generally they'll start sandbagging lands. And also, stronger players will often just hold back on lands anyways if it doesn't really help them to play the lands, in case they have some type of card later on that lets them draw and discard cards, or even just for bluffing. So this card definitely plays much better versus people that don't have that kind of potential for that sophistication, where they're just going to play every land they draw, play everything out, constantly go toward being hellbent. If you can hit them before their hand is empty, this card's amazing. But even with those players will actually just play out their entire hand, so you won't even have anything to hit. So it's kind of, there are some times where it's amazing, where they've got those last 2 bombs in their hand and you clear them out of the way, but there's a bunch of games where they have no cards in hand. There's a bunch of games where you're just hitting lands that they were smart enough to hold on to. So this type of card definitely varies by, what would you say, like the meta, or like your player environment, your community. Really depends on how good this card ends up being. Very player dependent. Glaze Fiend. This guy is, I promise you, way better than he looks. Whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, he gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This guy is just an absolute blowout in Limited. The last time he was around, he was absolutely terrifying, and we'll see how good he is, how much support he gets in this set. But, man, 2 mana, I mean, you were often hitting for at least 2 every single turn, if not 4 to 6 damage the first time around. Usually 0 power creatures are not a consideration, but the first time that he was around, there was so much support that he was just an absolute nightmare. Supernatural Stamina, Pauper playable card. Shout out for Zubera Storm. I sleeve this one up all the time, using Zuberas to deal lethal damage. Zuberas care about the number of times that other Zuberas have died this turn, so you're just killing your own Zuberas repeatedly. They're coming back with Supernatural Stamina and Undying Evil. It's a fun combo deck. If you've never seen it, we've got a few videos on the channel of it, and I really enjoy playing it, and people do seem to enjoy witnessing it or just watching the matches, as it is pretty ridiculous. It's the Scavenger, a 2/3 exploit, limited card only, Zombie Bird, Rush of Knowledge. Previously, people had played this with some kind of sneaky casting costs, so things like Mere Enforcer, or there's maybe Scorned Egoist, I think it is, a wizard with Morph that has like an 8 casting cost. It's probably not worth the 5 mana investment and the slot in your deck for limited, and that's, I mean, you probably, if you enjoy playing with this card, like, just have some fun. It is kind of the best you can say about this one. Riddlesmith, vintage winning card right here. Now this combos, I'm so psyched about this. This combos with a card that they actually put in this set to do really broken things. So whenever you cast an artifact spell, you can draw a card. If you do, discard a card. In this set, there is a Daredevil from Kaladesh that if it's in your graveyard and an artifact enters the battlefield, you return it to your hand. So with Riddlesmith, you're basically turning all of your artifacts into cantrips. It is hilarious that they put this in there. This just got on my radar, and I'm looking forward to playing it in Vintage alongside Paradoxical Outcome, as it just takes it to a completely different level. You're just supercharging things, and you've got some bodies to attack with too if the game becomes a train wreck. Relic Runner, 2 mana, 2/1. Can't be blocked if you've cast a historic spell. Going to be totally playable in limited, particularly in the artifact deck. Painsmith, I think they've got the full cycle in here. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, target creature gets +2/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn. Is going to be very good in that artifact strategy if you're also using black. Twisted Abomination. All of these land cycling guys are pretty powerful. I've always liked Twisted Abomination and Elvish Aberration the most, given the board presence that they have when they don't end up getting cycled, or even if you're able to bring them back from the battlefield to the battlefield from the graveyard. A 5/3 regenerator is a lot to deal with in limited. Sift, drawing 3, then discarding a card, could be an enabler for some of these strategies. Sarah Sphinx doesn't really need a broader game plan to be good here. 5 mana for a 4/4 flying vigilance. This is the original Sarah Angel stats thrown on a Sphinx, shifted into blue, and it's going to be absolutely phenomenal in any blue deck. Even if your strategy is not really coming together, the synergy is not working, if you're casting this on turn 5 and just starting the beatings, you're going to be in really good shape, able to attack for massive damage and hold off attackers. This one can win games all by itself. Sentinel of the Pearl Trident. I'm actually not familiar with this one, so I'm going to have to read it real quick. 5 mana for a 3/3 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile target historic permanent. If you do, return it under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So we've talked a little bit about flicker effects being useful in the set. Here's one at 5 mana with a 3/3 body, and I can see that having some utility in limited. Veldalkin Infuser. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a charge counter on target artifact. Sounds a little too cute to be playable, but I guess we'll have to see if there's anything that is worth getting that type of charge counters on. Steel Sabotage. This card's actually seen play in Vintage in the past, returning an artifact to its owner's hand or countering an artifact spell at 1 mana. Chalice of the Void eventually made it not really worth the gamble, but was Vintage playable for a short while. Brimstone Volley. A limited MVP, 5 damage if a creature died this turn is not a difficult condition to meet, so for 3 mana you're getting a ton of value, eliminating big creatures or just players. I mean, 5 damage is some reach. A pair of these in your hand can just close a game out in the blink of an eye, just 10 damage to the face, and this is definitely a dangerous card to be passing in limited. Bloodshot Trainee deals 4 damage to target creature. Only if his power is 4 or greater. You're going to need some type of, hopefully, equipment to make this guy bigger. And if you do, he's just going to be completely out of hand. That is a gamble and a investment, but if it pays off, it will dominate the board. Battle Rattle Shaman. At the beginning of combat, you can have a creature get +2/+0 until end of turn. For some reason, I feel like this card was actually good the first time around. When I'm looking at it, it's not super exciting. But I believe in the limited format that it was released in, there was enough tokens and stuff where this was a legit card. +2/+0, essentially creating 4 power worth of attacking on each turn, even by itself, which is the type of thing that happens. A lot of time you kind of have to address some worst case train wreck scenarios. If you have this guy and the board's clear and you're just giving him +2/+0, you're attacking for 4 each turn by himself for 4 mana is really not the worst, and it can be better from there. Balduvian Rage, kind of an interesting extra line of text. So target creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, and draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So, I mean, you probably killed them when you played this card, but if you didn't, you get an extra card, which is nice. Conclave Naturalist, when it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment. This card, I think, will be very good in this limited format, as you'll be able to destroy most likely an opposing creature or a really problematic artifact like some powerful equipment, and it's a 4/4 body, and at 5 mana that's really not a bad bargain at all. Clear Shot. This might have been an uncommon. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and then deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. That is a really good effect. At 3 mana instant, most of these end up being sorceries, so I mean, I think this card's potentially very good in limited. Chatter of the Squirrel, the Odyssey fan favorite, creates a 1/1 green squirrel and has flashback. It was not very good back then, but people absolutely loved it, and I definitely played against people who had like 6 copies of this in their draft deck, as they just took every single one at the table with zero hesitation. Elvish Aberration, tapping for 3 green, is a really nice upside to an already beefy body. 6 mana for a 4/5 is mostly fine, and forest cycling can be really crucial to the early game to making sure that you hit your land drops or smooth out your mana. So I've sleeved this card up many times over the years in limited and rarely been disappointed. Deathhood Cobra, 2 mana, 2/2. As I said before, this is the type of thing that you're often building your decks with in limited, and it's got a nice upside of gaining reach or death touch, a little mana intensive, but the fact that it can take down a really difficult to handle card like the Sarah Sphinx makes it kind of easily an inclusion in your green limited decks. 3 mana for Crushing Vines to destroy an artifact or a creature with flying. With both of those options, this could potentially be a main deckable card, though I tend to err on the side of not ever having dead cards in my limited pools, so this is a good chance this would just sit in my sideboard in case I'm playing some type of ground and pound fatty deck that doesn't happen to have any artifacts. Gelatinous Genesis, this was a rare, now downshifted, a XX and a green to create XX green ooze creature tokens is fine. It grates some bodies and is a late game very powerful card. So if you're paying X equals 2, you're paying 5 mana to get 2/2/2 creatures. At 7 mana, you're getting 3/3/3 creatures. It does scale very nicely. Ideally, if you're at 7 or 9 mana, this thing gets very, very out of hand. But 9 mana is a big ask without really good acceleration, like, say, Elvish Aberration. Fierce Empath, a card that has seen play in Legacy. When it enters the battlefield, you search for a creature with converted mana cost 6 or more, add it to your hand. This used to be used alongside food chain decks to get that extra mana and find your Emrakul to just end the game. In large, this is the first time that I recall looking at spoilers way back in the day when this art was first spoiled. I honestly thought it was filler art. I thought somebody had spoiled the card and just put some joke art on the card. It surprised me. I enjoy the fact that in retrospect that's a comical error, and then also I enjoy the fact that it is so different and kind of outside the norm of what we see for Magic cards. I don't think Magic should have kind of a homogeneous approach with their art. I think it should have a lot of variety, and it's one of the strengths of the game is that it's collectible and people can choose the pieces for their deck, and I think that's really important to be able to select art as well as effects. Skull Muncher, This guy does some heavy lifting in limited, and you're going to be very often getting like a 5/5 or a 6/6, sacrificing some tokens in this type of deck. And while I haven't seen as much support as perhaps there was the first time around, this guy is going to be something to keep an eye on. I wonder if he was a rare the first time. I think he was. I think this guy was a rare the first time. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong there. Might of the Masses. Target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature you control. Is an acceptable combat trick. That's all I've really got to say about that. Goblin Gavalier. A 1/1 Trampler for 1 that gets +2/+0 for each equipment attached to it. I mean, he's probably a trap. If you have that much equipment, you're probably fine anyways, and you probably would rather have something better to slap that equipment onto. So it'll essentially get really, really big with trample. Maybe I'm wrong. I just feel like in general, this guy's garbage without the equipment. And, if you've got a 4/4 that you're throwing equipment on anyways, it takes 2 pieces of equipment attached before this even starts to pay off. So we'll see. It depends on how cheap the equipment is. But for the most part, it didn't look super cheap. Dismantle, destroy an artifact. And if it had counters on it, put that many +1/+1 counters or charge counters on an artifact you control. A fun effect that is also quite powerful. Definitely a card that if you're playing red and it's a late pick, you're going to set that aside in case you do play against an artifact deck, which seems very likely in this format. Cathartic Reunion. Discard 2 to draw 3. This is a card that people had their eyes on after Faithless Looting got banned. And there's just a million copies of this. It's in the new Jace's Spellbook. It's in Ikoria. So didn't really need a reprint at all, but it must be because they expect it to be very good for the limited format, which it very well may be. This is the type of card that rewards you for holding on to those extra lands instead of just continuing to drop them, even if you don't need them, and challenges you to consider all of your plays, really not be able to play on autopilot when you have cards like that. Whisperer of the Wilds, a 2-mana 0/2 that taps for a green, or for 2 green if you have Ferocious, is not exactly the type of card that I typically like to play. Now, if you've got a bunch of equipment, it's possible that this is a fine addition, but in general, I would prefer my cards actually be capable of winning the game, and 0-power creatures not actually able to do that. Uvenwald Mysteries. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you get a clue token, and whenever you sacrifice a clue, you get a 1/1 human soldier. It is a bunch of extra steps. Not the type of card I'd typically sleeve up in limited, as it doesn't do very much on its own. Sylvan Might. Now, this is a card that I actually like a lot for limited. Quality pump, +2/+2 and trample, allows you to potentially push through lethal damage with a risky block in the late game. It also allows you to win kind of close games where you have similar sized creatures, where you can have a 4/4 being blocked by a 4/4 and just completely turn things around. I think this is actually very close to being playable in known metas. Like if you had like a Tarmogoyf meta where you're going to be facing other Goyfs, this is potentially fine for breaking through and having the threat of it in the graveyard. That 4-mana side of it is actually not used that often. It's mostly just a threat. Like you're attacking with the Goyf. They've got a Goyf. They've already lost the trade the first time. Like, what are they going to do? Block again just to get rid of the Sylvan Might? Like, they're just going to take the damage and try and race you. And this card, I've got a little bit of soft spot for this card, I guess. Orcish Vandal, sack an artifact and tap him to do 2 damage to any target is an interesting limited card. Doing 2 damage is pretty powerful. No artifact lands in this set, so it's going to be potentially a creature on its way out in response to removal. I think this card's going to be playable alongside the abundance of artifacts in the set. Lightning Axe was worth like $1. I think it was originally printed at common and then later at uncommon, so I don't think this is new at all to Pauper. I'm pretty sure the Reanimator decks actually play it already. And 5 damage to target creature for 1 red. Your additional cost is discarding a card or paying 5. And if you're happy to be discarding specific cards to your graveyard, this card does an awful lot for 1 mana. Kuldotha Flame Fiend. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack an artifact. If you do, it does 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. Is a potentially great card for 6 mana. Is a little much, but it does have a 4/4 body, and that's a great ability. That is kind of similar to the 5 mana Banshee, but a little bit more mana, and you have a little bit more control as you don't have to trigger Morbid. Kazul's Toll Collector, 0, attach equipment you control to him, activate anytime you could cast a sorcery. At common, I think he used to be an uncommon, and there's some fun stuff you can do there for casual, I guess. I mean, he's totally fine. 3 mana for 3 power, potential upside. Like, this is not an embarrassing card to sleeve up in Limited. Woodland Champion. Whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, put that many +1/+1 counters on Woodland Champion. Again, a 2/2 for 2 with upside. Gonna be playable in your limited pool. Skinbrand Goblin, same thing here. Also functions as a combat trick, potentially giving a attacking creature +2/+1 until end of turn. So very strong in aggressive decks. Salivating Gremlins. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This may prove to be better than the 0/1 that I was hyping up with flying. This is on the ground, but it at least doesn't take on the same risk of not being able to attack for anything. Even if you don't have artifacts entering the battlefield, this guy can still turn sideways for 2 a turn. I think this card is going to be very strong in artifact-based decks. Rapacious Dragon, a 5 casting cost 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, create 2 treasure tokens. Is very good alongside all of these things that care about enters the battlefield or sacrificing treasures. Of course, those treasures are also fine for smoothing out your mana and being mana acceleration. Prior Wild Shaman. I think this used to be a rare, and the card was totally playable back then in Limited. You can give a attacking creature +3/+1, and whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, if it's in your graveyard, you can pay 3 to return it. Makes it kind of like a Hammerbow Garden-esque card to constantly be returning and just gaining that type of advantage. Weapon Surge. When a target creature you control gets +1/+0 and first strike until end of turn, but that overload is where this card is super dangerous, giving your entire team first strike and potentially making a massacre out of a combat step that looked before this spell to be potentially somewhat equitable. Instead, you can just turn it into this one-sided slaughter for only 2 mana. Teamer Battle Rage, pauper playable card, also sees a little play in Modern. I think people are still using this with Death Shadow on occasion. This card's great at just ending games, and I have it in my artifact-based ATOG deck with Gearseeker Hulk. It's kind of affinity. It just doesn't have the Frog Mites and the Mirror Enforcers. It's just all big creatures, so it's all card drawing, a little bit of removal, and then eventually you find an ATOG or a 2-mana 5/6 and just eventually use a Teamer Battle Rage or a Fling to get them out of there. It is a very powerful card, and a card that people, in my experience, don't really mind losing to that much. It's kind of funny. Like, just given the giant creature double strike, it's like, all right, you really got me. Like, well done. Gore Clan Rampager. The 4-mana 4/4 with Trample has totally reasonable stats, but that Blood Rush is very tempting. Giving a creature +4/+4 and Trample is a blowout play in the early game, in the mid game, or the potential final blow to your opponent. This card just overall has a lot of game and is going to be very welcome. Possibly get you to go red-green early if you actually see this. Death Reap Ritual. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you can draw a card. Not a fan of this type of card. This is something that, for multiplayer Commander games, you might be happy making this type of investment if it's not like a super cutthroat game, as it will yield some type of benefit over time. But in a limited game, taking 4 mana to play this and then sometimes start drawing some cards is not ideal. Selesnya Guildmage. Great card in Limited. The fact that you can make an army. Remember, this is at instant speed, so you always have this mana sink. By the time you're sinking 8 mana a turn, the game is very close to over, and eventually that overrun effect is just too much to handle. Giving creatures +1/+1 is brutal, and will also create standstill in the sense that you'll have a board and your opponent will have to assess if they attack what happens if you pump once or twice. Very often they can't attack you, which just leads to more and more green saprolings, which later on just make it more and more unlikely for your opponent to be able to attack you on the ground profitably. Weapons Trainer, the 2 mana 3/2 is very good stats for the uncommon, and other creatures get +1/+0 as long as you have an equipment. That is a dangerous limited card that can lead to some aggressive starts and should be very playable in those colors. Mishra's Factory, I think we already covered this one. You're going to play it. I mean, it's really good, very low cost, just a single land slot is really the issue, and it creates a 2/2 that's actually difficult to remove and has that bonus for if you've got multiples or changelings. Any other factory workers it can pump. Buried Ruin, you can pay 2 to return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. This has been seen, this has actually seen play in Vintage before. It's a land, again, low cost to include. It doesn't come into play tapped or anything like that, so it's really just a question of the mana, color, and being able to return something from your graveyard is a nice upside that can potentially be really big with certain threats that you might have, or even answers like the spell bomb. Is that what it is? Not the spell bomb, the Executioner's Capsule. Accomplish Automaton, Fabricate 1, so just a giant body for 7 at common, and that's one of the larger creatures in Pauper as printed. Cogwork Assembler, a 3 mana 2/3 that you can pay 7 to create a token that's a copy of target artifact, and then that creature has haste, exile at the end of the next end step. So an infinite mana sink if you somehow manage to get infinite mana in any of your games. Clone Shell, I actually don't remember. I remember this card, I just don't remember what it does. A 5 mana 2/2. The imprint is look at the top 4, exile 1, and put the rest on the bottom. And then when he dies, turn the exiled card face up. If it's a creature card, put it onto the battlefield under your control. So sure, yeah, I mean, it's fine, I guess. I mean, you have to have something really exciting for this to be super worthwhile. 5 mana for a 2/2 is an awful lot, and that does look a lot like cards that you see in decks that are struggling to get a win. Cathodian, the 3/3 for 3 is reasonable stats with an upside that can potentially be used in some combo applications. This type of thing was actually a drawback back in the day. So Su-Chi was the first card along these templating. Cathodian was kind of its baby sister. And the 4/4 for 4 Su-Chi would give you 4 mana when it dies, which was actually kind of a problem back in the day. It was potentially going to do 4 points of mana burn, and now that rule has been eliminated from the game in all the formats except 93, 94, and I think that's the only format. I don't think middle schoolers play with mana burn, but you know, running something like JM Tome or Mishra's Factory used to be important to make sure that you didn't just get absolutely murked by your own mana pool. Darksteel Axe. This card's going to be really good. 1 mana, equipped for 2. It's no Bone Splitter, but it's pretty close to a Bone Splitter. So it doesn't pass back and forth as easily, but it's very good at giving creatures with evasion a whole lot of extra punch. And that's a very dangerous card to make your smaller creatures potentially able to trade up, and is going to be welcome in most of your limited decks. Calling Diaz, the 2 mana kind of goof around card. You can sack a creature to put a charge counter on it, and you can remove, you can pay 1, sacrifice it, and then draw a card for each charge counter. So basically you're going to be responding to removal to kind of charge this thing up, and then eventually you're going to pay 1 and sacrifice it to draw some cards. It is a lot of extra steps, which, you know, some people really enjoy doing that, and that's probably the extent that this will see play, is people who specifically enjoy kind of assembling contraptions. Core Tapper, tap to put a charge counter on target artifact, and you can sack it to put 2 charge counters. Does play really well with that Culling Diaz. This is a bit of a fan favorite card as well, is there's some goofy things that you can do with it. Flayer Husk, I've actually sleeved this one up a bunch in Pauper alongside cards like Atog and Mirror Enforcer and Frogmite, just kind of lower to the ground affinity decks that are looking to come out swinging and potentially use this +1/+1 later on to make their creatures even bigger. Everflowing Chalice. Now this was, I'm pretty sure this was a uncommon. I think this is going to be a big printing for Pauper. I apologize if I'm wrong on that, but I think this is actually a first time being available. And I can see Tron players potentially taking this card and just getting insane amounts of mana, just way over the top. This is an interesting addition. Eager Construct, a 2/2 for 2 that you get to scry. That's going to see play in a lot of decks. That'll be something that will disappear from the table in a draft before people hate draft, I guess. Like, I would probably take that over most cards that you'd hate draft, even if you don't end up playing it. Golem Skin Gauntlets, +1/+0 for each equipment attached to it. So a lot of the games, this is just going to give it a single +1/+0. This one's, it takes 3 pieces of equipment before it's better than that Darksteel Axe, and is a little bit of a trap. Golem Artisan, the 5 mana 3/3 here, nice infinite mana sink, and also can give flying, trample, haste for 2 mana. Your choice for an artifact creature you control is fine-ish. I mean, colorless is actually a much bigger deal than people give it credit for in Limited. I think there are plenty of games that I've seen great players lose where they put their hand down and they just don't have enough of the correct color mana to do what they need to do, and that never happens with colorless cards. Gleaming Barrier, 2 casting cost, 0/4. When it dies, you create a treasure token. Not the type of card I'd play in Limited. Perhaps a sideboard card versus super aggressive decks if your deck is going to have a really terrible matchup, but not particularly exciting. If you got the treasure up front, it would be a radically different thing, but the fact that it has to die to get any upside is kind of underwhelming. Iron League Steed, 4 mana, haste, and is often going to be a 3/3 haste, is totally fine. Iron Bully, another fine Limited card. I've sleeved this one up before. Magnifying Glass, interesting card for Limited. So usually when you're investing 3 mana in an artifact like this, it's actually going to help smooth out your mana. Here it's strictly acceleration as it adds colorless, but it gives you a interesting late game where you can pay essentially 6 mana to draw a card. So you got to pay 4 to investigate and then 2 to draw a card. That is a lot of mana, but it is an extra card a turn in a standstill, so this could be good in control strategies in Limited. Just taking a look at the art. That's interesting. Giora's Familiar, we've already covered that. Artifact Enabler. Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and lose a life, and then you can pay 3 to do it again. It's an artifact. There's a lot of synergy with artifacts. Sandstone Oracle, 7 mana, 4/4 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, that player has more cards than you, draw cards equal to the difference. So 7/7, that can potentially draw some cards. A 7 casting cost that can potentially draw some cards, and is a 4/4. I mean, that's not an embarrassing card for Limited at all. Peace Strider. When it enters the battlefield, gain 3 life. They just have a whole bunch of artifacts here, which are going to be playable in most people's decks. I've never actually said this out loud. Naginata. This is a card that from Saviors of Alara was really gross. Like, this would just cause big problems, making all of their creatures just lethal threats that also would push through extra damage when you blocked. I mean, it demanded an answer. And this card was actually worth a little bit for a while when it came out too. I mean, it's a brutal card, and the first line of text there, sorry guys, is super important. Can only be attached to a creature with power 3 or greater. It makes other equipment so big. Like, if you can take a 2/2 and then bump it up and then get this on there, like, oh my goodness. Or like a 1/1 token and give it a buff and then throw this on there. Like, you're just turning your 1/1 tokens into like 6 power trample murder machines. And this card is going to be very, very dangerous and Limited. Sickle Slicer, 3 mana for a 2/2 creature that also is a 2/2 equipment. These type of cards are dangerous. I mean, it does take away one of the main problems with equipment, which is having equipment and no creatures is a disaster. Sickle Slicer at least brings a germ to the yard, and you know that's saying something. And it's only 3 mana. It's really not too bad. The 4 mana to equip is really the only pain point on this card, as everything else is pretty fairly priced. Surge Node, the 1 casting cost trinket here, enters the battlefield with 6 charge counters on it, and you can pay 1, remove a charge counter to put a charge counter on target artifact. Kind of whatever crazy contraptions you've got going on, this may be part of them. Sphinx of the Guild Pack, 7 casting costs. It's all colors, flying, and has hexproof from monocolored. So this card's actually pretty difficult to deal with. You're not going to be able to abrade it or cast down or anything like that. A 5/5 flyer for 7 is a little expensive. I mean, my curves in general, like 7 is the absolute, like 7 is tough. 8 starts to get like, oh, what are we doing here? 9 is just crazy. The game has to go on for a really long time. Like, you're not casting a 7 casting cost card on turn 7 most games. If that's the case, you've probably drawn only lands all game, and you're not going to be in great shape anyways. So 7 casting cost cards are really to be used sparingly. As fun as they are to have these big splashy effects, you really do need stuff to be able to play out in those early turns, or there won't be any later turns. Skinwing, a 4 casting cost, 2/2 flyer here, living weapon. And again, the pain point being the equip at 6 is just so much. It is a common, and you may not have to take that the first time around. The +2/+2 in flying, though, is a very, very good effect, especially in decks that don't have access to flyers. So if you're throwing that on a giant green creature, for example, it is pretty freaking spicy. Tumble Magnet. This is a card that was constructed playable. I have like a playset of really cool altered ones even. I'm surprised it doesn't see play in Pauper. It may at some point, as it's a good control card, to really just slow the game down. And that was without any like proliferating back in the day. It was just enough to slow people down and drag them into the deep end of the pool. And that said, I actually don't know how good this will be in limited. If you've got some type of not proliferate, but some type of charge counter manipulation, which isn't terrible. Like, if you don't want to stretch to get to, you don't want to stretch to make this card work, but if it happens to work out synergistically, I mean, 3 mana to essentially eliminate their best card every cycle is pretty much fine. Volshock Gauntlets, 2 for a +4/+2 equipment, and it equipped creature does not untap, and its controller's on tap step. You do kind of have to pass these around in order to get good use out of them, and that 3 isn't the end of the world. It's potentially playable, and it does push through a lot of extra damage. I will say, if you've got a couple of flyers, even a 2/2 flyer, you throw this on there, hit for 6, and then take and pay 3 to bounce it onto something else. It's pretty busted. Though it is quite slow, but it will eventually get them. Unlicensed Disintegration, destroy target creature. If you control an artifact, it does 3 damage to that creature's controller. Is an incredibly good limited card here, killing a creature and doing 3 damage to their controller, because you're going to be playing artifacts. There's just so many great ones in this format. So that one's going to be at a premium, one of the best removable cards that we've seen in the set. And here's the card that I was so excited about, Oval Chase Daredevil. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. So that 4/2 for 4 is nice, and like that's actually going to be relevant in this limited format. But for me, that's actually exciting to see that they gave us the Riddlesmith combo, where it's just going to allow you to recur like crazy. I was going to dig into my Kaladesh bulk to see if I had any of these kicking around, but now I guess I'll just wait for Double Masters, as hopefully we'll be doing some box openings, and we'll see how this set goes. I mean, it looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. Let me know what you guys think, but I am excited to play with this set. That is, as I thought, the final card there, saving the best for last, perhaps. All right, guys, thanks for watching. that is all for this one. But don't worry, there is a lot more. You can check out our older videos, and we're always putting out new videos from ELD's Time Vault Games in Bellingham, Massachusetts. If you want to help the channel, of course, you can like, subscribe, share, tap that notification bell so you can know the next time our new videos come out. Thanks for watching.